We remember him as the man who never bowed before an empire. And yet Daniel let Babylon change his name, change his food, change the language he thought in, and even the profession he would devote the rest of his life to. He yielded on almost everything, and even so, he spent 70 years inside the nation that razed his city and burned his temple, and he came out of there without having stopped being who he was. 70 years. Almost an entire human life under the roof of the enemy that had taken everything from his world. That's the contradiction of Daniel. How do you let them change almost everything about you for decades and not end up turned into someone else? The answer is more uncomfortable than it seems. There was a single line, one small and almost invisible, that he refused to cross. Everything else he handed over. And most people miss exactly that part. Everyone knows the fiery furnace. Everyone knows the den of lions. But between miracle and miracle, decades passed. Decades of something much harder to survive than a lion or a flame. Daily life inside the most powerful empire on earth. The day-to-day, the routine, the slow pressure year after year of a system designed to make you forget who you are. What was it really like to live in there? What did he eat? What did he see when he woke up? What did he study? What did the city smell like? How does a man stay faithful to his God for 70 years in the capital of foreign gods? That's what we're going to reconstruct today, piece by piece. And not with pious legends, but with what the biblical text says in one hand and what the archaeologists have unearthed in the other. Because there are clay tablets buried for 2,500 years that confirm the exact world in which Daniel opened his eyes every morning. Before we go on, let me ask you something quick. If you like this kind of history, the real kind, with the Bible and archaeology in hand and no inventions, give me a like. If you don't like it, no problem really, I understand perfectly and we keep going here. But if you give it, you help me know that this family wants more of this, of the serious, of the well-made. And that's all. Let's go back to Babylon. To understand Daniel's life there, first you have to understand how he arrived. And the way he arrived already says almost everything. The book that bears his name opens with a precise date. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, says the first verse of the 1st chapter, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came against Jerusalem and besieged it. This happens in the 6th century before Christ, more than 600 years before the birth of Jesus. And it's not a loose fact. That same year, the Babylonian army had crushed the Egyptians in a decisive battle in the north, at a place called Carchemish. And in a single stroke, the young prince Nebuchadnezzar had become the most powerful man in the known world. What's interesting is that we don't know this only from the Bible. There exists a set of Babylonian tablets written by the empire's own scribes that historians call the Babylonian Chronicles. They are official records year by year of the military campaigns. And those chronicles describe exactly this. Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns toward the west, toward the land of Judah. The enemy that destroyed Daniel's world left written record that it did so. The two accounts, the Hebrew and the Babylonian, shake hands. Now pay attention to a detail that changes the whole story. The fall of Jerusalem did not happen all at once. There were several waves. The first, the one that took Daniel, was the earliest and the mildest. Judah was not yet raised. It simply surrendered and became a vassal state. And as proof of submission, Babylon took two things, some treasures of the temple and a select group of young men. Years later, a second deportation would come. Much harsher, when another king of Judah rebelled and thousands of people were torn from the land. And later still, a third, the worst of all, the one that ended with the Temple of Solomon turned to ashes and the city reduced to rubble. The second book of Kings, in its chapter 24, describes these waves in chilling detail. But Daniel was not in either of those two. He left in the first, in the earliest. When there was still no total war, when Jerusalem was still standing, which means something extremely hard to imagine. When Daniel arrived in Babylon, his city still existed. His temple still smoked with incense, not with fire. His family, probably, was still alive far away, and he, from the distance over the years, had to learn little by little how all of that, everything he had left behind, was being destroyed. He didn't live it, he knew it, which is sometimes worse. And why him? The text is very specific about who they took. In the 4th verse of the 1st chapter, the king's order describes the exact profile they were looking for. Young men, without physical defect, handsome, intelligent, wise, with the capacity to learn, and of noble family, of royal or aristocratic lineage. Stop a second on that, because it's chilling in its coldness. They did not take the weakest, they took the best. The flower of a generation, the sons of the important families, the brilliant young men who would one day have led Judah. The empire did not want slaves to haul bricks. It had whole peoples for that. What it wanted was to steal a nation's future and put it to work for itself, to empty Judah of its potential leaders and turn them into Babylonian leaders. It was a strategy, not a whim. You take the most promising young men of the conquered people, you educate them in your culture, you give them your language, your gods, your customs, and in one generation, you have loyal officials who understand that people from the inside but think like you. Hostages turned into ambassadors, captives turned into cadres of the empire, and the young man this happened to, along with 3 others from his land, was named Daniel. Now imagine the journey. The distance between Jerusalem and Babylon. Following the routes of the time, which skirted the desert rather than crossing it, was more than 900 miles, weeks and weeks of marching. A teenager, torn from everything, walking day after day toward a place he had only heard rumors of. And at the end of that exhausting road, something rose up from the horizon that no boy from the province of Judah could even conceive. Because you have to understand what Babylon was. It was not simply a big city. It was, almost certainly, the largest city in the world of its time, the center of the known universe. Probably the first city in history to approach the great population figures that seem normal to us today. For a young man who came from Jerusalem, a respectable but small city perched on its hills, arriving in Babylon must have been as if you, today, left a quiet town and were suddenly dropped alone in the heart of the most imposing metropolis on the planet. The river Euphrates ran through the middle of the city, splitting it into 2 halves joined by a bridge. Imagine the noise, the smell of the river water mixed with the smoke of 1,000 kitchens, with the sweat of the multitudes, with the incense of the temples. Merchants shouting in languages Daniel didn't understand. Soldiers, priests with shaved heads, chariots, the constant din of hundreds of thousands of people living piled up between walls. And the walls. The walls of Babylon were legendary even in antiquity. The Greek historian Herodotus, who wrote about the city a century after Daniel, claimed they were so wide that 2 war chariots could run side by side along the top, and so tall that they seemed to touch the sky. Now let's be fair. Many historians today consider Herodotus's figures exaggerated, and archaeology suggests more modest measurements than the ones he gave. But even discounting the exaggeration, Babylon's defenses were one of the engineering wonders of their age. A double line of walls that made the city, in the eyes of any enemy, simply impregnable. And then there was the gate, the one young Daniel crossed as he entered. The Ishtar Gate. Stop here, because this is not a conjecture or an imaginary reconstruction. That gate exists. You can go and see it. The German archaeologists excavated it at the beginning of the 20th century, recovered its bricks, and today a reconstruction of the Ishtar Gate stands inside a museum in Berlin, thousands of miles from where it once stood. And when you stand before it, you understand the shock that boy must have felt. It was a mass covered with glazed bricks of a deep, intense, brilliant blue. A blue that in that world of mud and desert must have seemed torn from the sky itself. And over that blue, in relief, rows and rows of animals, dragons with scaly bodies dedicated to the god Marduk, and powerful bulls. The gate led to a great avenue, the processional way, down which, on the great festivals, the statues of the gods paraded among crowds in ecstasy. A boy from Judah, raised in a faith that strictly forbade making images of God, that forbade statues, reliefs of gods, sacred animals, entered his new life by passing through a gate covered precisely with that. Images of gods everywhere. It was in every brick the empire's message. Here other gods rule, and you now live in their house. And dominating it all, visible from almost any corner of the city, rose something even more imposing. A gigantic ziggurat, a stepped tower of 7 levels that climbed toward the sky like a mountain made by human hands. Its name was Etemenanki, which in the language of the place meant more or less the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. It was dedicated to Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, and many scholars have noted the inevitable echo, a colossal tower on the plain of Babel that aimed to join heaven with earth. Any reader of the scriptures who arrived there could not help thinking of that other tower, the one in the Genesis account, the one men built to make a name for themselves and reach the sky. Daniel lived literally in the shadow of that idea. And now we come to the most famous thing about Babylon, the thing everyone associates with the city, the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Green, lush terraces that, according to legend, cascaded over the city like a mountain of vegetation in the middle of the desert. Well, here I have to be completely honest with you, because this channel doesn't sell you fairy tales. Of all the wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens are the only one for which not a single firm archaeological proof has ever been found. Not one. In Babylon, no remains of them have been discovered. And, what is more surprising, Nebuchadnezzar left hundreds of inscriptions boasting of his works, his temples, his walls, his palaces, and in none of them does he ever mention a garden. A researcher at the University of Oxford, Stephanie Daly, has even proposed that the famous gardens were never in Babylon, but much farther north, in the Assyrian city of Nineveh, built by another king a century earlier, and that the Greek authors, over the centuries, confused the two cities. Does that mean Daniel didn't see beautiful gardens? No. Babylon was rich and surely had palaces with trees and water. But the postcard image of the Hanging Gardens floating over the city, the one you have in your head, has to be treated for what it is. A beautiful legend, possibly real, possibly exaggerated, possibly located somewhere else. And I prefer to tell you that straight than to paint you a pretty scene that maybe never existed. But a city is not only its monuments, it is, above all, its daily life, what is touched and smelled and eaten each morning. And the material life of the great city had a very concrete texture, because in that plain between the rivers there was no stone, no quarries, no nearby mountains from which to take blocks. Everything, absolutely everything, was built with the one thing there was plenty of: mud. Clay bricks dried in the sun for humble houses, and bricks fired in kilns, much more resistant, for the palaces, the temples, and the defenses. And as mortar in the great works, they used bitumen, that natural tar that seeped from the soil of Mesopotamia. The Genesis account, when it describes the construction of the Tower of Babel, says it with an astonishing precision. They used brick instead of stone, and bitumen instead of mortar. Whoever wrote that knew firsthand how cities were built in that land. Imagine then the color of the young captive's everyday world. A sea of fired clay, a golden brown under the sun. Flat-roofed houses crowded along narrow alleys, organized around inner courtyards where the family lived in the cool of the shade. And the heat, a real heat, the heat of the Mesopotamian plain, which in the summer months turns into an oven and pushes people to sleep on the rooftops seeking the night air. And everywhere, the gentle water of the canals, because that land between the Tigris and the Euphrates was a marvel of hydraulic engineering. A network of irrigation canals that distributed the water of the rivers across the fields and turned a parched valley into one of the most fertile and richest regions of the ancient world. That abundance was the secret of Chaldean power. Whoever controls the water in that land controls the bread, and whoever controls the bread controls everything. And what was eaten in those houses? Not the delicacies of the palace, of course, but the solid diet of the valley. Barley bread above all, the king of grains in the region. Dates, thousands of dates, from the palms that grew everywhere and that gave sugar, fruit, and even a kind of syrup. Fish from the river and the canals, onions, garlic, leeks, lentils, sesame oil for cooking, and beer, a thick barley beer drunk through a reed to get past the dregs, and so basic to daily life that work was often paid for with it. That was the everyday flavor of the city, where the boy from Judah had to learn to exist. Clothing also marked the new world. People wore tunics of wool and linen, often with fringes at the edges, and men of a certain standing wore their hair long and their beards groomed, curled into ringlets in the fashion of the court, just as we see them portrayed in the reliefs that have survived. To dress each morning for a young Hebrew official was to put on, literally, the appearance of another culture. And there was something else that was everywhere and that defines that civilization: writing. Babylon wrote. It recorded everything: receipts, contracts, letters, lists, omens, prayers. Everything was inscribed with a stylus on clay tablets that were then kept by the thousands. It was a society obsessed with leaving record. Remember this detail, because at the end of the story it will return, and in a way that raises goosebumps. And there was one day on the calendar, the most important of all, when that civilization poured itself entirely into the street, the Great New Year Festival, which in the language of the place was called the Akitu, and which was celebrated in spring over about 12 days. It was the religious heart of the entire year, and it mobilized the whole population. According to the ritual texts that have been preserved, during those days the statue of the god Marduk was the absolute center of everything. There were ceremonies, recitations of the great Babylonian poem about the origin of the world, and endless sacrifices. The king had a central and indispensable role. The festival could not be celebrated without him, because it was he who, inside the temple, took the hand of the statue of Marduk, and thus received year after year the confirmation of his right to reign. There is also a famous rite, which we know mainly from a much later ritual text from several centuries afterward, and which some scholars dispute whether it was actually practiced in this era. In it, the monarch was stripped of his insignia, a priest struck his face and pulled his ears, and the king declared before the god that he had not sinned against the city. However that detail may be, what is beyond doubt is the climax. An immense procession, in which the statues of the divinities went out on parade, came down the processional way, passed through that Ishtar Gate of blue bricks, and were carried in triumph amid a fervent crowd to a special house on the outskirts. Now put yourself in the place of the boy from Judah. Every spring, year after year, for decades, the whole city exploded into this celebration. Past where he lived and worked went, on shoulders, the idols of the city, amid music, shouts, and the bows of a kneeling people. The whole capital worshipped, the whole court bowed, and in the midst of that human tide there was one man, and a few more like him, who did not bend his knee, not out of arrogance, not out of contempt, but because his loyalty was placed in another. That's a very particular kind of solitude, that of being surrounded by hundreds of thousands of people given over to something in which you, in conscience, cannot take part. And that solitude did not last a day, it lasted a whole life. All of this, is what that newly arrived teenager had before his eyes. A city that was a blow to the senses and at the same time a blow to his faith on every corner. And within that city, the empire was going to set to work on him. It was going to begin to take him apart, and for that, it pulled 4 levers. 4 tools to turn a son of Judah into a son of Babylon. Let's look at them one by one, because by understanding those 4 levers, you understand exactly what his life was like. The first lever was the most intimate of all, the name. Today we find it hard to feel the weight of this, because for us, a name is almost a label. But in that world, the name was the soul of a person put into words. The name said who you were, whose you were, to what God you belonged. And the names of those 4 young men of Judah were, all 4, small confessions of faith. Listen to them. The main character was named Daniel, which means God is my judge. He carried God in his name every time someone called him. His friend Hananiah meant something like, the Lord has been gracious, the Lord has shown kindness. Mishael meant, according to the most common reading, who is like God. A question that is really a declaration. And Azariah meant, the Lord is my help, the Lord sustains me. Do you see the pattern? All 4 names ended or began pointing to the God of Israel. Each one was a seed of faith that parents had planted in their son. Every time those young men heard their own name, they heard a reminder of who truly governed them. And that, exactly that, was the first thing the empire took from them. The 7th verse of the 1st chapter records it with a bureaucratic coldness that's frightening. The chief of the officials, says the text, gave them new names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah, Shadrach, Mishael, Meshach, and Azariah, Abednego. Now notice what really happened there, because it's brilliant and cruel at the same time. They did not give them just any names. They took 4 names that pointed to the God of Israel and replaced them with 4 names that pointed to the gods of Babylon. Belteshazzar invokes the god Bel, which was another name for Marduk, the supreme god of the city. In fact, later, in the 4th chapter of the book, in the 8th verse, Nebuchadnezzar himself says it without mincing words. They called him Belteshazzar, after the name of my God. And the name Abednego contains the god Nego, a form of the name of Nabu, the Babylonian god of wisdom and of scribes, who was also the king's favorite god. Allow me a note of honesty, because here you have to be careful. The exact meaning of some of these Babylonian names, especially Shadrach and Meshach, is still a subject of debate among the specialists. We don't know with total certainty what they meant word for word. And whoever affirms it to you with absolute certainty is selling you more confidence than the evidence allows. But the general pattern is crystal clear, and no one disputes it. The empire changed names that said the God of Israel for names that said the gods of Babylon. The operation was not administrative, it was theological. It was an attempt to rewrite, in the very language with which those young men were called each day, whose they were. And then something happens that seems to me one of the most moving things in the whole account, because the book, throughout its pages, is going to keep calling him Daniel. Again and again and again, Daniel. The text refuses, in practice, to use the name the empire imposed on him, as if the scriptures themselves were saying they can call you whatever they want in their palaces, but we know what your name really is. The name by which your God knows you. Think about it applied to you for a moment. There are names the world puts on you, labels. People decide who you are, classify you, assign you a role. But there's a name beneath all those, the true one, the one that really defines you. Daniel lost the name in the official records of the empire. He did not lose the name in his heart. The second lever was more subtle, but deeper still. Language and education. That same 4th verse of the 1st chapter, the one that describes which young men they were looking for, also says what they wanted them for. To teach them, it says, the language and the literature of the Chaldeans, and they were to spend 3 full years in that training before presenting themselves to the king. 3 years of intensive re-education. And you have to understand what that really meant, because it was not a little language class. The language of the Chaldeans was Akkadian, written in that wedge script on clay that we call cuneiform, one of the oldest and most difficult forms of writing in human history. It did not have an alphabet of 20-some letters like ours. It had hundreds of signs, each with several possible values. Mastering it took years. It was the knowledge of a tiny elite. And the literature of the Chaldeans was not innocent poetry. It was the entire body of Babylonian knowledge, which was soaked in religion everywhere. The Chaldeans were famous throughout the ancient world as the great masters of observing the stars. They studied the sky night after night, recorded the movements of the planets, the eclipses, the positions of the stars, and from all of that they drew omens about the future of the king and the kingdom. They had entire series of texts, copied and recopied over centuries on clay tablets dedicated to interpreting signs, what an eclipse meant, what the flight of a bird foretold, what the entrails of a sacrificed animal revealed, what a strange birth portended. I want you to stop and feel the brutal tension of this. A young man who worshipped the one true God, a young man who believed that the future was in the hands of the God of Israel and not in the stars, was seated for 3 years to memorize, copy, and master the sacred texts of Babylonian divination, the manuals of the astrologers, the wisdom of the Magi, everything his own faith considered, at best, vanity, and at worst, abomination. And to truly understand what that was, you have to understand how it was learned. Writing, in that world, was a craft transmitted with the patience of years, almost always from master to apprentice and from parents to children, within a handful of families who guarded that knowledge like a treasure. The one who learned began as a child with the most basic things, copying over and over long lists of signs, lists of words, of names of gods, of animals, of trades, of rivers and of peoples, until they were engraved in his memory and in his hand. Then came the proverbs, the hymns, the ancient stories. And only at the end, the few who made it to the top accessed the most complex texts, the treatises on the sky, the manuals of omens, those scholarly series that were copied with an almost obsessive care so that not a single sign would be lost along the way. Because that was the other face of that culture. In a society where the vast majority of people could not read or write a single line, the one who mastered the clay and the wedge belonged to a tiny and extremely powerful circle. The great collections of tablets, the archives kept in temples and palaces, preserved the accumulated knowledge of more than 1,000 years of civilization, and the key to that entire treasure was held by a few. To learn to write was not to learn just another trade. It was to enter the control room of one of the oldest cultures on earth. And into that room, by order of the king, 4 teenagers of a defeated people had just been pushed so that they would master it from within. Let me reconstruct a scene, and I want to be clear that it's a reconstruction, an image, so you can see the world, not a word-for-word account of the text. And it's worth clarifying something up front, because the image of a school we have in our heads doesn't fit that world. The teaching of writing was not given in large classrooms full of students, but in small groups under the hand of a master scribe. The case of these 4 was also special because it was a palace training, paid for by the king to prepare his chosen young men. So imagine a room in the royal compound, the mud floor, the heavy heat of the valley. In the hands of the boy from Judah, a tablet of soft clay and a reed stylus. Before him, a master who recites in Akkadian, sign by sign, row after row of wedges. Nearby, a few more young men, sons of powerful families, repeating, engraving, erasing, starting over. By day, the Hebrew learned thoroughly the science of the city, and we can imagine by night, in a low voice, he prayed to the God of Jerusalem in a language none of those masters understood. And then comes the first great twist of the story, one that almost no one notices. What did Daniel do with all that pagan education? Did he reject it? Did he refuse to study? Did he cover his ears? No. He learned it, he mastered it. In fact, the text says he mastered it better than anyone. When they finally presented themselves to the king, at the end of those 3 years, Nebuchadnezzar examined them and found them 10 times superior to all the magi and astrologers of his kingdom. The foreigner beat the locals at their own game. This is hugely important for understanding who Daniel was, because it dismantles a simplistic idea. Daniel was not faithful by shutting himself off, by refusing to learn, by despising the culture that surrounded him. He was faithful in the midst of it. He studied the language, mastered the literature, understood the system better than its own priests. And yet, in the center of his heart, he did not convert. He learned to read the omens of the stars without believing, not for an instant, that his destiny was written in them. And it turns out that excellence, that superior capacity, was exactly what opened the doors of the palace to him, and what again and again, over his long life, saved his life. The system they wanted to use to convert him, he used to survive. That's one of the great silent lessons of his story. And before moving on to the third lever, I want to ask you a question, and your answer really matters to me. Daniel yielded on the name, he yielded on the language, he yielded on the education, he learned everything they put in front of him. And yet, there was one point, a very concrete one, at which he said enough. Which do you think it was? Where do you put the line between adapting to a world that isn't yours and betraying yourself? Think about it, because Daniel's answer is surprising, because the third lever, the place where he did draw the line, was the table. Food. The 8th verse of the 1st chapter contains one of the most important sentences in the whole book. Daniel, it says, purposed in his heart not to defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine that he drank. Purposed in his heart. Notice the language. It was not an outburst. It was not a teenage tantrum. It was a thought-out, inner, deliberate decision, and what he decided was to refuse the king's food. Now, this needs context, because at first glance it seems strange. The empire had taken his name, and he didn't protest. It had put the wisdom of the astrologers into his head, and he didn't protest. And he's going to make a whole problem out of dinner? Out of food. To understand it, you have to know what the king's portion was, the best food in the whole empire. Choice meats, refined wine, the finest that the richest land in the world produced. To eat from the king's table was an honor, a privilege, a sign of favor. For most of those young men, it must have been a dream, but for a faithful Jew, that food brought 3 problems wrapped in its delicious aroma. The first, it most likely included meats that the law of Moses forbade, unclean animals that a son of Israel should never eat. The second, the meat of the ancient world was almost never prepared according to the rules the Hebrew law demanded regarding blood. And the third, perhaps the most important of all, in Babylon, the palace food was offered first, ritually to the gods. Before reaching your plate, those delicacies had been dedicated to Marduk, to Bel, to Nabu. To eat from that table was not only to fill your stomach, it was, in some way, to take part in an act of worship to foreign gods. And there, right there, Daniel said, "No, I learned your language. I memorized your omens. I answered to the name you gave me. but I am not going to put into my body that which makes me a participant in your gods." What he did next also reveals his character, because it was neither arrogant nor reckless. He didn't make a scene. He didn't insult the king. He negotiated. With respect, with intelligence, he proposed a test to the official in charge of them, a man who, according to the text, feared losing his head if those young men weakened and the king got angry. Daniel proposed a simple deal: give us only vegetables to eat and water to drink for 10 days, and then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat from the king's table. And if we're worse off, do whatever you want. 10 days, an experiment. And at the end of those 10 days, says the text, the faces of Daniel and his 3 friends looked better and healthier than those of all who ate the royal delicacies. So the steward simply withdrew the king's food and left them with their simple diet. Now, a necessary warning, because I know how this passage is sometimes used. This is not an ad for a miracle diet. The point of the account is not that vegetables make you better looking, nor is it a nutrition manual. The point is theological. God honored the faithfulness of some young men who, in a small and everyday matter, chose not to defile themselves. The miracle is not in the lettuce, it's in the blessed faithfulness, but the underlying question is still there, pulsing, and it's the one that truly matters. Why the table? Why did Daniel yield on so many things and draw the line precisely there, on what he ate? I believe the answer is profound. The name others put on you, it doesn't depend on you. The language they teach you, the things they force you to study, come from outside. You receive them passively, but what you decide to put into your own body, that is yours. That is an act, an active, daily, intimate choice. Food was the last territory that depended entirely on his will. It was the place where the empire could not compel him without his consent. And that's why it was precisely there that he planted the flag, not in the great and visible, but in the small and everyday that still belonged to him. And that's why I want to ask you again, now seriously, to go down to the comments and answer me. If they took almost everything from you, the name, the work, even the language you think in, where would your line be? What is that thing, perhaps small, perhaps invisible to others, that you would not hand over for anything in the world? Write it below. I really do read them, and I think the answers to this are going to be one of the most interesting things in this video. We come to the 4th lever, and with it we enter the true day-to-day of Daniel over decades. Because the first 3, the name, the language, the food, were the battle of his youth, of those first years. The 4th was the battle of his whole life, the constant, daily pressure of living and working inside a world given over entirely to other gods, because Daniel was not a captive, locked in a dungeon. That's one of the great misunderstandings. After his training, Daniel became a high official of the empire, a sage of the court, a counselor to the king, a man with a position, with responsibilities, with an office, to put it in modern terms. He spent his days in the palace or near it, surrounded by the other sages, the magi, the astrologers, the diviners, that intellectual class the texts call the wise men of Babylon. Daniel worked shoulder to shoulder every day with the priests of the gods his faith rejected. And let me make you aware of the emotional weight of this, because it's easy to overlook. Daniel served the empire that had destroyed his people. Every day he got up, dressed in the Babylonian manner, walked through streets dedicated to Marduk, and went in to advise the king whose armies had reduced the temple of Jerusalem to ashes. He had to be loyal, competent, useful to a system that he, in his deepest heart, knew was under the judgment of God. That's a tension lived in the soul, day after day, and for years. It's not a miracle of a moment, it's a marathon of faithfulness, and I want you to see up close what that workplace was like, because it was at once the most prestigious and the most dangerous in the kingdom. The book itself, in describing the experts of the court, does not speak of a single guild, but of several distinct groups that coexisted and competed with one another. the Magi, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans, who were the caste of astrologers specialized in reading the sky. It was a whole ecosystem of specialists in the invisible, each with their methods, their texts, and their claims to knowledge. And above all of them, over the years, the young Hebrew came to occupy a post of the highest responsibility, because that's how an empire was governed in that world. The great decisions, war, politics, public works, were not made with cold calculation alone. The gods were consulted, signs were sought, an eclipse could delay a military campaign, a dream of the monarch could shake the whole kingdom. The entrails of a sacrificed animal could tip the destiny of thousands. There existed entire series of tablets, copied and recopied over centuries, that catalogued omens. What this or that position of a planet meant, what a strange birth foretold, what a spot on the liver of a sheep revealed. And the trade of those sages, the profession the boy from Judah was part of, consisted in deciphering all that and telling the king what the heavens supposedly wanted from him. It sounds like a job of luxury, of office, library, and prestige, but it had a dark and deadly side. You served a man with absolute power and often with an unpredictable temper. If the sovereign had a nightmare, and no one managed to interpret it to his liking, if a prediction failed, if he suspected a deception or a betrayal, his wrath could fall on the whole guild at once. In fact, the second chapter of the book narrates a chilling episode in which the king, beside himself, dictates an execution order against all the sages of the capital without exception, and the soldiers go out to find them to put them to death. The young foreigner and his companions were on that blacklist for the simple fact of belonging to the court. I won't tell you now how that was resolved, because that's a whole story for another day. But hold on to the fact that truly matters for understanding his daily life. The post that had saved him from slavery was at the same time a post in which your head could roll from one day to the next at the whim of a monarch. Every dawn in that palace was, in a way, to walk on the edge. And in the midst of that double pressure, the intellectual and the deadly, the sage of Judah did something that set him apart from all the rest. He did not pretend. He did not invent answers to please. Again and again, over the years, when it was his turn to speak before the throne, he gave credit not to his own cleverness, nor to the stars, but to the God of heaven, who reveals mysteries. At the very summit of the most sophisticated divination system of the ancient world, the man who mastered it best was, at the same time, the only one who didn't believe a word of it. He worked among diviners without being a diviner. He made his living reading the sky without putting his faith in the sky, but in the one who made it. Now, to truly understand what Jewish life in Babylon was like, you have to leave the palace for a moment and look downward toward the common people, because Daniel was the golden exception. Most of the deportees of Judah did not live in palaces. How did they live? And once again, archaeology gives us an astonishing window into the past. There exists a set of clay tablets, about 200 of them, that scholars call the Al-Yahudu tablets. The name says it all. Al-Yahudu means the city of Judah, or the town of the Jews. It was literally a village of deportees from Judah in southern Babylon, and those tablets are the everyday documents of that community over 2 generations. And what do they reveal? Something precious. They reveal that the common Jews in Babylon were not chained in labor camps. They lived. They farmed the land. They bought and sold. They paid taxes. They lent money. Some prospered and accumulated goods. They had contracts, debts, businesses, a normal economic life, and a beautiful detail, many of them kept their Hebrew names, names that carried within them the God of Israel, written by the Babylonian scribes on their tablets. The community did not evaporate. It put down roots, and that fits perfectly in a way that raises goosebumps, with a letter the prophet Jeremiah had sent them from Jerusalem to those very exiles. It's in the 29th chapter of his book. Jeremiah writes to them on God's behalf an instruction that must have sounded scandalous. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their fruit. Marry, have children, multiply there, do not diminish. And seek the peace of the city to which I have carried you, and pray for it, because in its peace you will have peace. Do you realize how radical that message is? God does not tell them, resist, sabotage, live with your bags packed waiting to return tomorrow. He tells them, live, plant, build, flourish even here, even in the enemy empire, even far from home. And the Al-Yahudu tablets are the archaeological proof that this is exactly what they did. Houses, gardens, businesses, families, a community of faith surviving and even prospering in a foreign land. Let's reconstruct another scene. Again, with the honesty of telling you that it's an image, an illustration of the world and not a verse. Imagine the irrigation canals of southern Babylon, that flat and fertile land crossed by waters. Imagine a family of Judah, 2 generations after the deportation, working a field that is now theirs. The grandparents perhaps still remember Jerusalem. The grandchildren know it only from the stories. It's evening. The sun sets over the still water of a canal, and someone in a low voice sings a song of their land. Perhaps that same lament that was engraved forever in Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, and we wept when we remembered Zion. A community that lived, that worked, that laughed at its weddings and wept at its dead, and that in the depth of its heart, beside the waters of a foreign empire, never stopped remembering where it came from. But there's a question those tablets cannot answer, and it's perhaps the most important of all. If the exiles lived, planted, and prospered, how did they manage to keep worshipping their God far from home? Because there was a problem there that shook the faith of Israel to its foundations. Their whole religion revolved around a single sacred place, the Temple of Jerusalem. There, and only there, the sacrifices were offered. There, the presence of God dwelt in the midst of his people. And what happened when that temple had been reduced to ashes and you were more than 900 miles from its ruins, in a foreign land with no hope of returning soon? You could not sacrifice. You had no altar. You did not have the place. For many, it must have felt as if God himself had been left behind, buried under the rubble of Zion. And yet, exactly the opposite happened. In the exile, far from the sanctuary, the faith of Israel did not go out. It transformed, and many historians see precisely in these years of captivity the origin of a change that would mark that faith forever. Without a temple where they could sacrifice, the center of gravity of the religion shifted toward something else, toward the written word. To read, copy, and remember the scriptures and the law became the heart of spiritual life, toward prayer as a way of drawing near to God without the need of a stone altar, toward the Sabbath, that holy day that depended on no place and that could be kept in any corner of the world, and toward the marks of identity that a Jew could carry with him wherever he went, within his own body and his own house, without the need of a building. The faith became, for the first time in a full way, portable. It stopped depending on a temple to depend on a people who remembered, read, and prayed wherever they found themselves. Not a few scholars place here in these communities of the exile the remote roots of what would later be the synagogue, the place of gathering and reading, and the deep reason why this people would come to be called the people of the book. And the sage of the palace is the perfect image of that new and portable faith. Later, in another chapter of the book, we find him already old with a custom that says it all. 3 times a day, he withdrew to an upper room of his house, opened the windows in the direction of Jerusalem. That city, which by then had spent decades turned to ruins, knelt and prayed. Without a temple, without an altar, without sacrifices, only a man. A window opened toward the lost land, and prayer rising in silence. That was the faith no empire in the world could confiscate, because it was not made of stones, but of memory and loyalty. They had torn the temple from him. They could never tear from him the direction toward which he knelt. And archaeology gives us one more piece, one that touches royalty directly. When those German archaeologists excavated the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, they found in an underground room near the Ishtar Gate an enormous archive of administrative tablets. They were basically receipts, records of rations of oil and barley delivered to prisoners, workers, and dignitaries of conquered lands who lived in Babylon. Hundreds of them. And among all those tablets, 4 mention a figure by his name and his title, Joachim, king of the land of Yahudu. That is, Jehoiachin, king of Judah. That same Jehoiachin, whom the second book of Kings tells us, was deported to Babylon. He appears by his name in the palace's pantry records, receiving his rations from the royal kitchen along with his sons. A king of Judah, recorded by the empire's accountants, eating the bread of Babylon. The Bible said he was there. The clay tablets confirm it, with his name and his title intact. Those documents are today also kept in a museum in Berlin, and they were first published by a scholar named Weidner back in the first half of the 20th century. I want to stop a second on what all these stones and tablets really mean, because it's the heart of this channel. I don't tell you about them to impress you with data. I tell you about them because they prove that the world in which Daniel lived is not a world of fantasy. It's a verifiable world. There are tablets that mention a king of Judah who was deported, just as the Bible says. There's a whole village of Jews documented in the clay, living just as Jeremiah wrote to them to live. There are Babylonian chronicles that record Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns against Judah. The setting is real. The play was performed in a theater we can still touch. Now, in the name of that same honesty, let me tell you something many channels hide from you. About the book of Daniel itself, about when exactly it was written and by whom. There is a real debate among scholars, and I'm not going to pretend to you that it doesn't exist. But that debate, whatever your position on it, does not touch what we are seeing today. That the portrait of the Babylonian world, the book paints, the city, the customs, the titles of the court, the mechanics of the exile, fits in a remarkable way with what archaeology has pulled from the earth. Daniel's world is historical. Of that, there is no reasonable doubt. There's even a precious detail that joins 2 books of the Bible through a single tablet. When Daniel and his companions were placed under the care of a high official, the text, in the 3rd verse of the 1st chapter, calls him by a title, the chief of the eunuchs. It was a concrete post of the Babylonian court. Well, in the year 2007, a specialist named Michael Jursa, rummaging among the more than 100,000 tablets kept in a museum in London, found a small clay receipt. It was a most mundane transaction. An official was donating a quantity of gold to a temple in Babylon. But that official bore a name and, above all, a title that is extremely rare in ancient documents, Chief of the Eunuchs. And that same name and that same title appear in the book of Jeremiah in its chapter 39 among the Babylonian officers who entered Jerusalem when the city fell. A man mentioned in passing in the Bible, confirmed 2,500 years later by a gold receipt written in clay. And that extremely rare title, Chief of the Eunuchs, is exactly the post of the man who received Daniel. Daniel's world fits, even down to its most obscure bureaucratic titles. Speaking of that title, there's an uncomfortable question that's fair to raise, and I raise it with care. Those deported young nobles were placed under the authority of the chief of the eunuchs, and there's an old discussion among scholars about whether the youths of the royalty taken to Babylon, according to the custom of the ancient courts with their palace servants, might have been made eunuchs themselves. There are even those who connect it with a harsh prophecy that the prophet Isaiah had spoken to King Hezekiah generations earlier, announcing to him that some of his descendants would be taken and would serve as eunuchs in the palace of Babylon. I want to be clear, this is not affirmed anywhere about Daniel directly. It is a debated possibility and not a fact. and we cannot know it with certainty. I mention it because it's part of the serious conversation about his life, but I leave it where it belongs, in the realm of the uncertain, not the affirmed. And now we come to the dimension that makes Daniel's life simply astonishing: time, duration. Because until now, we have spoken of his youth, his arrival, the 4 levers. But all of that was only the beginning. Come back with me to the number we started with. 70 years. Where does that figure come from? The book itself gives us the 2 ends of the thread. At the end of that first chapter, in verse 21, the text drops a fact that's easy to read past. And Daniel continued until the 1st year of King Cyrus. Cyrus, the Persian king, the one who would conquer Babylon. And later, in chapter 10, in its first verse, we find him still active, receiving a vision, in the 3rd year of that same Cyrus. Do the math with me, slowly. Daniel arrived in Babylon as a teenager in the first deportation in the 6th century before Christ, and he was still standing, serving, receiving revelations when the Persian Empire already ruled in the 3rd year of Cyrus. Between those 2 points there are close to 70 years, which means that that boy of 15, or whatever age he was, reached the end of his life turned into an old man of more than 80. He served throughout his entire adult life, without interruption, within the same system. And now comes the fact that makes it almost unbelievable. Think about how many kings and how many empires passed over Daniel while he was still there, firm. He arrived under Nebuchadnezzar, the great king, the builder, the conqueror. And Nebuchadnezzar he buried. Then came other Babylonian kings, weaker successors, conspiracies, assassinations at the summit of power. Daniel saw them all pass by, and he lived long enough to see the night when the whole empire, that Babylon that seemed eternal, that city of impregnable walls, fell all at once before the armies of Cyrus and the Persians. The superpower that had taken Daniel away as a child collapsed, and Daniel was still there to see it. Let that hit you well. The empire that kidnapped Daniel to turn him into a Babylonian, to erase him, to dissolve him in its culture, that empire went extinct, and Daniel outlived it. The captive buried his captors. The foreigner they wanted to make disappear was still standing when the nation that captured him was already history. And then, an old man, he served the new empire too, the Persian, with the same integrity with which he had served the previous one. That's the definitive twist, the greatest of all, and I want you to see it clearly. The assimilation machine failed. It failed completely. The plan was to take a young man of Judah and, through the name, the language, the food, and the pressure of a whole lifetime, turn him into a man of the empire who would forget his origin. And the result, 70 years later, was exactly the opposite. Daniel did not become a Babylonian. He became the most constant, most reliable, most respected man in Babylon without ever ceasing to be who he was. He was the only thing that stayed the same, while everything else, the kings, the dynasties, the whole empire, rose and crumbled around him. And here there's a final irony that seems to me one of the most beautiful things in this whole story, and with it I want to close. Do you remember the second lever? Language, cuneiform writing. That 3-year re-education in the tongue and literature of the Chaldeans, which the empire imposed on Daniel to absorb him, to turn him into one of them. Do you remember? Well, look at what happened over time. That same writing culture, that Babylonian obsession with recording everything in clay, with leaving record of every ration of oil, of every name, of every transaction, of every military campaign. That same machinery of scribes they wanted to use to swallow up Daniel is precisely what has allowed, 2,500 years later, that we can confirm the world in which he lived. The tablets with the name of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. The village of Al-Yahudu, full of Hebrew names, the receipt of the chief of the eunuchs, the chronicles of Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns. All of that exists because Babylon wrote. The empire that wanted to erase a son of Judah ended up, without meaning to, writing him into stone forever. The culture that tried to make him disappear is the one that guaranteed he would never disappear. So when someone tells you that Daniel's life was two spectacular miracles, a furnace and a den of lions, remember it. Those were the moments. But the true story of Daniel was the years in between, the decades, the daily routine of getting up in a city that was not his, wearing clothing that was not his, answering to a name that was not his, working for an empire that was not his, surrounded by gods that were not his. And in the silent center of all that, day after day, for 70 years, not letting go of the one thing that truly belonged to him. They changed his name. They changed his food. They changed his language. They changed his city, his king, his empire, his century. They changed for 70 years, absolutely everything. Everything except what he decided not to hand over. And if you want to see what happened the night when 3 of those young men of Judah, Daniel's friends, stood up to that same empire, refused to kneel before the king's statue, and were thrown into a furnace heated 7 times more than normal, that video is waiting for you there, on the screen. What happened inside that fire is even harder to explain than everything you've just heard. Subscribe, and I'll see you in there.